Welcome to Blueprint to Billions, Leverage and Legacy in Apartments.
Welcome to Season 2 of Blueprint to Billions, where legal strategy meets real estate scale. HUD attorney and multifamily housing strategist Terry Bruner has spent his career guiding developers, nonprofits, and investors through complex housing transactions with the focus on building both legacy and leverage. I'm Evan Mack, and last episode we talked about the power at the table. Today we zoom out to see what happens when those relationships spill into the community. Terry will share how HUD deals become blueprints for impact, why trust changes outcomes, and how leaders can think bigger than the bottom line. This is Community First. Terry, sir, welcome back.
Hey, welcome back to you too, Evan.
So in the last episode, we kind of got down to, the power in the room. So let's kind of zoom out and get that bird's eye view. How do those relationships spill over into the community?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, and it's not, which sounds like doublespeak, I know. It's complicated in the sense that at the core of every real estate deal, it's a dollars and cents proposition, right? So it needs to make sense from a monetization standpoint. It needs to make sense from an investment standpoint. It needs to make sense just in terms of, how the costs are aligned. So sometimes it is absolutely true that the community first aspect of a deal is just not going to support a particular project, just given the cost of it all and given all of the things that are involved with making a deal, such as a multifamily deal that's at scale work. But that being said, there are instances where the stars do align. And I think in one of the, in perhaps the biggest way in which we see that happening is where there are public-private partnerships. And so we deal obviously with a lot of HUD work, and HUD is instrumental in that. But one of the biggest components that people talk about and has been leveraged to build affordable housing over the last, 40 or 50 years has been something called the low-income housing tax credit. That's essentially a partnership between the federal government, the state governments through community and housing affairs and in whatever analogous departments there are, and investors, all seeking tax breaks, but to build things at scale, buildings at scale that are multifamily. And I think when you're able to ideally leverage all of those pieces together at the federal, state, local levels, and with the private investment community, then you can actually come up with deals that not only make sense, but that are in a long-term sense very accretive to the community as a whole. And I think one of the biggest and largest ways we see this happening now is in an instance where veterans housing is being built and where senior housing is being built. All very critical needs and all, both worthy causes, but there's got to be a rallying point for that to occur.
So why do you believe HUD or TPA deals aren't just transactions, but maybe community blueprints?
Well, because I think at the core of what these transactions are supposed to do, they are actually supposed to leverage the federal government's backstop insurance capacity to do things in communities. And when done the right way, you can actually leverage a great sum of government dollars to then partner with investment dollars to actually build things that communities need. And I think you've heard me say this before, but there's such a big misnomer around HUD being just in communities that are urban.
Yep.
I think one would be shocked that, if you looked at some of the deals that our firm is working on right now, some of those deals are not in places where you would expect, urban development being there. Some of these are communities of 30,000 people, or fewer, and while that's not exactly, rural, it's not exactly, inner city Brooklyn either. And I think that when the government does what the government is uniquely positioned to do, it can marshal the right influences together to make deals such as these work. And I think, when you look at it that way, TPAs are just TPAs, new construction, all the HUD programs are just wonderful vehicles to leverage all those resources together to build something wonderful.
Can you share a story of a project that changed not just the investors, but maybe the entire neighborhood?
Well, there is I'll give you one that we're working on now. So there's a project that actually is slated. It's actually under consideration right now, but it's being slated to be something that will be a bulwark for veterans, some of whom have PTSD, and some of whom just have other challenges. But it's basically a mixed concept, so it's mixed use. It's got all sorts of mixed income, and it's just been a neat thing to see how communities, and particularly even some marginalized communities, but just how communities have been able to come together to do something for the public benefit. And I think we sometimes hear so little about that now, but there are still these wonderful deals that are being done. And I'd personally like to see more of that happen. And frankly, if we could do more workforce housing that incorporated workforce and veterans and seniors together, I think it's the perfect metaphor for America. But there are projects like the one I just talked about that are springing up all across the country. You don't hear about them a lot. They may not be happening as much at scale as they could, but I think they are blueprints for what could happen in a way that you could not only leverage dollars to make profit, but obviously also dollars that could go for a public benefit and for public good.
Mm. So how do you measure impact beyond just ROI?
Well, I think the answer most people would give in my shoes is what's the return? So what's the dollar return on it?
Right.
I think, to your question, there has to be more than just dollars and cents. And I say this a lot, but if a project can actually transform how a community interfaces with each other, so to the,
Mm.
if for example, uh, an apartment building spurs a new school being built, if it spurs new development in terms of maybe there are food deserts that now you've got a great grocery store that's coming in, or you have a playground that's there because it wasn't there previously because there weren't enough children to really support that. I
Mhm.
think those are the things that add just as much value as whether or not your P&L or your balance sheet says that you're making money on these things. And so from a community perspective, and just building things that matter and that endure over time. I think this is not soapboxy, I hope, but I think we've got to start to rebuild what it actually means to be in community with each other. And I think that
Mm.
starts with the physical infrastructure, the built environment that's around us that actually make those kinds of lives conducive to the ones we want.
Wow. So what's the responsibility of these leaders though in these deals to think bigger than maybe just that bottom line or just how much money they're going to make?
Well, it's look, you're asking me to tell my clients to be concerned about something other than making money.
Yeah.
And I think you come to the table, I think, with that orientation up front, and it's not necessarily something that I need to tell you. But that being said, I think there are all sorts of tools, all sorts of inducements that governments can use and leverage together to encourage developers and to encourage more investors to make these kinds of pivots. So I
Mm.
guess what I would say is, look, if if you build something that's actually good for the community as a whole, the likelihood is that it's also going to be good for your bottom line. And that's got to be, I think, if you're looking at it just from a very brass tacks perspective and not
Mm.
necessarily from an altruistic one has to see that what is good in the short term may not be good in the long term, but what's good in the long term generally is going to be good over the entirety of the project itself. So not it's not just a question of like, am I building with the right building materials? It's also, am I building with the right frameworks in mind as to how these things are going to actually proliferate and work for the community long into the future. I mean, think about it. If a building is going to stand for 50 years, you want it to be there and serve as a bulwark of sorts for all the right things in where you're building. And yeah, you're probably not going to own it for those 50 years, but even when you get ready to sell it, if you build something and the community around it is stable, is sound, you're always going to have a good ROI on that no matter what.
Mm. When communities trust the people behind the deal, what changes?
Oh gosh. One, you cut out so much of the mistrust from the beginning, and you get to collaboration and partnership much more effectively, much more easily than you normally would. There's just this tension of sorts, that when you've got a developer who's coming in and they want to build something, the tension is that, well, all they want to do is make money and they're going to cut us out of the process. But
Right.
imagine if you're sitting at the proverbial table and you are actually talking to mothers and grandmothers and uncles and fathers and teachers and firefighters and police officers and all sorts of people who live in a community, who want to make neighborhoods work, and you're bringing them to the table with their best ideas, and you're bringing your ideas together. It makes for much more fruitful conversations when you actually sit down with lenders and ultimately with HUD, because what happens in those rooms is you can validate your position by saying, hey, we've spoken to the people who live there or who are proximate to there, and these are the things that we hear, these are the things that we want. Well, not only have you enlisted them as a resource for what HUD wants, but now HUD can actually look at you and say, this is someone who actually wants to build community first partnerships, and that matters. And so for all of the neighbors who may one day be your tenants in that particular building, they're already then coming to you and coming to the position of this project with a much more open and fair-minded perspective of what could be. So you're operating really from the sense of what's possible, as opposed to, oh my God, this is just the dirty developer coming to do harm to our community.
Hmm. For professionals building their own legacies, how can they think about that impact even at a smaller scale?
And by professionals, I mean I'm assuming you mean lawyers, accountants, people in the
Yeah.
traditional professions. Yeah, I think this
Yes.
goes back. This goes back to owning your expertise, but beyond
Right.
just owning the expertise that you have, you also have to always understand that it's about relationships. Beyond anything else, the relationship comes first, and the relationship is the predicate upon which everything else is built. You could be the smartest person in the room, you could be the smartest professional in the room, but if you don't have relationships, it's going to be really hard for people to trust that expertise, and really hard for people to see beyond what's actually just in front of their faces. So, in my estimation, when you're building that trust, and when you're building the things that you're seeking to do ultimately in your professional life, you start from the relationship perspective. And
Mm.
look, the relationship goes in a lot of different ways. It could be a client relationship, it could be a community relationship, it could be a relationship with the people who are in elected office, it could be a relationship with the people who work at HUD, the average bureaucrats who are going to push deals through and be responsive. The worst thing you can do as a professional is to ever underestimate people and their primacy or position in a deal. Um, in fact, it's a lot of times going to be the very currency you need to get things done. So
Mm.
as you move through those circles and you build your expertise, you also want to build your relationship and the capacity of those relationships to not only endure but to deliver ultimately for things that you need.
So Terry, what happens in those relationships if they break down after the deal? Who feels that ripple effect?
Everybody does. I mean, it's
Mm.
impossible. Everybody feels a relationship that has broken down, and there could be any number of reasons why those relationships ultimately bend or break. Sometimes it's the deal itself that causes those breakdowns to happen. Sometimes it's something that happens after the deal. Maybe, for example, a partner dispute, or maybe something was promised to a group that didn't actually deliver, or wasn't delivered in the process. It could be for any number of reasons, but I shudder to think of a time where relationships went south, and where things actually were ties were severed, where that didn't make a difference ultimately in what was happening at that particular project. I've even seen deals where things got built, beautiful gleaming apartment complexes were built, and 2 or 3 years later, the owners find themselves in bankruptcy because the relationships were so broken, and
Wow.
deadlines were missed, promises were made that were not kept. and ultimately there's a piper that needs to be paid, and that's
Hmm.
an unfortunate set of circumstances, but I've seen it. But everybody feels it, and ultimately there will be material consequences for people who suffer as a result of those things.
Hmm. And Terry, what about you? How do you personally think about balancing profitability with community legacy?
Well, listen, um, you can make a lot of money in life, and I've got the very privileged perch of being an attorney, so that comes with a degree of leverage, of influence, and privilege. But I try to ascribe to a sense that what is going to survive long after I leave the business and long after I leave the practice of law is not only the sort of relational capital that I've built, but whether or not I can look at myself in the mirror. I like to
Hmm.
sleep well at night. I like
Hmm.
to, I like to try my darndest to treat people the right way, and in doing that, that's a paradigm that goes beyond just money. It's a paradigm
Right.
that goes beyond profitability. And I also think, frankly, we sometimes define profitability too narrowly. Profit is not just about revenue. It's not just about what is left over on the bottom line. Profitability might mean time. Profitability might mean, experience. Profitability might mean relationships. Profitability just might mean feeling good about something you've done. And
Hmm.
in that vein, if I'm able to say, hey, I worked on this project and maybe I didn't make the greatest fee on it, but it was the right thing to do and it was the
Right.
right project to work on. Hey, I can live with that, and I'll take that every single time. And that's what I would say to any professional, to any developer, to any person looking to get into HUD deals or real estate in general, is you've got to honor the deal first, and then you've got to honor also how you portray yourself and what you want
Hmm.
to be ultimately at the end of it all.
Good stuff. So next time we'll shift gears into resilience. What's one hard truth you've learned about staying the course when headwinds come?
Well, the hardest is that headwinds will come, which no one likes and none of us wants to deal with. I've had points along the journey in deals and even just in my general law career where things weren't what I wanted them to be, and it's really
Mhm.
easy in those moments just to throw up your hands and say, I'm done. I'm calling it. That's the end of it. And I think particularly when you find yourself in economic or financial headwinds, you have to keep the main thing, as they say. And
Hmm.
doing that means that you just have to stay the course, and you have to build yourself, build in yourself enough resiliency to know, hey, I've just got to hold on a little bit longer. And maybe I'll have to do some other things that I don't want to do right now. But if I can develop a short term plan to get to the bigger plan at the end, that's what matters.
Awesome. Terry, sir, appreciate you.
You are quite welcome.
Thank you all for tuning in to Blueprint to Billions. If you're navigating HUD back development and want to elevate your credibility from day one, connect with Terry Bruner at terrybrunerlaw.com. And if you're an attorney looking to build a legal practice on your own terms, outside of the big firm pressure and into a niche that actually reflects your values, check out Terry's course at thenichepractice.com. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone that might find this information helpful as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.